I've known since I was a student that being a forensic pathologist could expose me to frightening situations. I got ready for it. After I started practicing, I thought nothing could surprise me because I had read a ton of manuals, reviewed countless photographs and testimonies of violent deaths, and obsessively studied every part of human anatomy. However, there are times when events occur that go beyond what we think we know, and the line separating the incomprehensible from reality blurs, leaving a bitter taste. I recall the day my certainty crumbled. I was working in a small Kentucky town where everyone knew each other by their first and last names, and the majority of forensic cases were ordinary traffic accidents. It was an inner trembling you never fully recover from. Natural deaths among the elderly and the odd fight that ended tragically were nothing like what I was about to experience. 6 months prior, I had been assigned to the local hospital's morgue, where we had a small but reliable staff and a small space. We were effective despite having only a few steel examination tables, a small refrigeration unit, and a makeshift lab, and I never felt cold. After passing through those doors, a body that was unlike any I had ever seen was wheeled that morning amid a dense, deafening silence. It belonged to a girl who was no older than 11. She had a very pale complexion and a remarkably enlarged abdomen that was so tense that it felt like something inside might burst at any time. The physician was unable to identify the cause of death right away. I tried to steady myself as I looked at her for the first time, but something in his eyes contained fear. As I read through his notes, I felt a lump form in my throat. He wrote that the girl had been found in a vacant lot on the outskirts of town with no obvious external signs of violence, and that her clothes were stained with a reddish-brown fluid that appeared to have been seeping for hours. Her facial expression was also described as being frozen in a state of extreme pain. Life had felt so normal that it seemed impossible to find such a nightmare in a place so remote, but reality was catching up to me so quickly that Silent Morgue felt like a confessional revealing the darkest facets of human horror. I couldn't help but think of my own daughters or the neighborhood kids who ran around the park on weekends that very morning while I was having coffee. I followed all the procedures to prepare the body for the autopsy, putting on my gloves, adjusting my face mask, and turning on the overhead lights that shone on the steel table. I closely inspected the swelling and found small marks on the skin that appeared to be internal scratches. Even though there were no obvious external abrasions or cuts with my scalpel in hand and my fingers trembling a little, the unusual rigidity surrounding the navel area was particularly noticeable. When I started the incision, I was overcome by a suffocating smell that was much worse than the typical cadaveric smell. It was an acrid, almost sickly sweet stench that made my stomach turn. I cautiously opened the cavity in the hopes of discovering an internal hemorrhage or peritonitis, which could account for the unusual bloating. However, what I saw caused me to gasp and take a step back in shock because among her twisted intestines was something strange and unthinkable. A rag doll covered in dark fluids had a misshapen face, eyes that had once been just buttons fused with clotted blood, and what might have been a dress that was now reduced to shreds. My skin crawled at the doll's expression, which gave the impression that its cloth features were twisted rather than just stitched. A shiver of fear ran up my spine. Its mouth opened in a silent scream that felt uncomfortably human. When I finally caught my breath, I leaned in for another look because the air around me felt heavy, as if it were charged with something evil. For a brief moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, either that overwhelming smell or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. There was no logical way that an object of that size could wind up there without any external tears or injuries. So I carefully started separating the tissues to remove the doll. With each movement, my horror increased. The doll wasn't just put there. It appeared tangled among the intestinal loops as if it had been absorbed or swallowed by the child's body. After several agonizing minutes, I finally freed the doll and placed it aside on the table. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest and the air in the room feeling stifling. My assistant, who had stayed a few paces away, gave a sharp gasp upon seeing the doll and covered their mouth and closed their eyes in an attempt to process the sight. The intestines seemed to coil around the doll's limbs like fingers gripping it, making it an agonizing task both technically and psychologically. I still had fluid-covered gloved hands that were shaking so badly that the room was too quiet. Under normal circumstances, I would have carried out the autopsy to determine the official cause of death. But the image of that blood-soaked doll with its ripped face staring at me with a distorted warning that I couldn't interpret upon closer examination of the abdominal cavity left my mind blank. It seemed as though the doll had always been a part of her body, an intruder with no trace of entry for a few seconds. I did not find any signs of violence or trauma that might explain the doll's presence, nor were there any wounds that would indicate a forced insertion or any indication of any covert surgery or strange ritual. Despite my panic attack, I made myself keep my professional composure. I started narrating my initial observations, my voice trembling as I presented an unusual textile object without any visible cuts. But every word sounded so ridiculous, as though I were dreaming of something unreal. I continued checking the rest of her body for wounds, bruises, and indications of abuse or poisoning. Nothing clarified the circumstances. Everything came to a standstill, and my gaze went back to the doll that was waiting to be examined. Her lungs were swollen, as if she had experienced abrupt respiratory failure or something similar to drowning from the inside. But there was no fluid in them, and her heart displayed a slight enlargement that made no sense for a child of her age. I tried to concentrate on the paperwork as if creating some semblance of normalcy could anchor me that night because I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl's bloated belly with the doll stuck in her intestines, and its twisted rag face locked in a silent scream. Its vacant gaze was unbearable, as if it might blink at any moment. I felt queasy and knelt in front of the toilet, perspiring in fear. As soon as I composed myself, more terrifying visions came to mind. I saw the girl at my bedside, staring at me through hollow eye sockets and holding that awful doll to her chest. I attempted to come up with logical explanations, such as the possibility that the doll had been placed inside her after she passed away, that it was the product of a sinister cult employing methods I couldn't have imagined, or that the girl had a rare illness that led her to consume doll fragments. However, there was no evidence to support any of these theories. Over the course of the following few days, I kept examining the corpse, collecting samples and examining the doll to look for fibers or other evidence. Wherever I looked, the doll's cloth was partially disintegrated and soaked in bodily fluids. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation that would never come. However, from the empty lot where her body had been found, I did not find any foreign hairs, fingerprints, or even mud or dust. The doll was missing an arm and a portion of its face, as if it had been corroded by a chemical for which there was no obvious reason. Local officials everyone eyed each other suspiciously, waiting for a bigger scandal to emerge. Deep down, I knew this wasn't the result of normal human violence. I'd seen violence before, but rather something else that broke the rules of what we consider reality. They whispered among themselves that maybe I was afraid to reveal evidence of a possible cult activity, or that I couldn't confront the truth. Soon after, I started having recurrent nightmares. In other dreams, I was powerless to stop the girl's bloody trail as she wandered the hospital hallways with the doll stuck in her stomach. A cold dread crept through me as if the place had become shrouded in darkness. At times, I heard footsteps around me, faint creaks, or the subtle clang of metal instruments when no one else was around. I was the one lying on the autopsy table when she opened my abdomen to place that horrifying doll inside, stitching me up with a black thread I couldn't tear. Mornings found me drenched in sweat, my palms bearing crescent marks from my own nails. One afternoon, while looking at tissue samples of the girl under a microscope, my assistant confided that a rumor was circulating around town that people believed the body was cursed and that the doll was a dark amulet seeking its next host. I noticed that my coworkers seemed tense too, though none of them admitted to feeling the same. We all pretended to be professional, as if filing data mattered more than facing the sinister gloom that had descended upon us. Although I wasn't superstitious, the case was entering mob territory. It was as if no one knew who the girl really was, or if they did, they ran away from the truth. Eventually, we identified her from local records that matched her physical description. But the situation became more confusing because she had been reported missing 3 years prior, had a name, and a listed address. Even the local pastor refused to bless the body, saying he felt an overwhelming dread in its presence and that he couldn't bring himself to pray near forces unknown. However, when we got to that, we discovered nothing but the burned remains of a house. Neighbors refused to talk, and some elderly residents whispered stories meant to frighten disobedient children or hinted at past tragedies. It felt like the entire town had a secret that I was unaware of, one that they kept to themselves out of sheer terror. As my investigation progressed, my nights became more agonizing, and every time I closed my eyes, I had to revisit the autopsy. With a silent, eternal scream, the doll's deformed face was exposed by the scalpel slicing the skin. I initially attributed the creaking sounds I was hearing in my own house at night to the wind or footsteps in the hallway or the refrigerator door opening on its own. My keys began to appear in odd locations. The front door was frequently left open in the morning, and I was paranoid. I thought that something had escaped from the autopsy, and occasionally I thought I saw the girl's silhouette in the shadowed areas of my living room. Her stomach was swollen, and a hideous doll was sticking through her rib cage. I was so distraught that I thought about quitting. The idea of laying another body on the morgue table, turning on those lights, and finding something even more horrifying made me sick. But I told myself that I couldn't run because I needed answers, even though my hands were shaking all the time. While going through the file one afternoon, I noticed something unsettling. The girl's clothes didn't match the ones she had on the day she was reported missing by her family. She was discovered wearing a white dress that was blood-stained, and the floral embroidery on the dress was odd as well. I kept the dress as proof and sent it to a specialized textile lab in a nearby city for additional examination. It was my first time leaving that oppressive place since the nightmare started, but the short trip out of town felt refreshing. Upon explaining the origin of the dress, the lab technicians appeared uncomfortable, but they acknowledged that the embroidered flowers did not resemble any known commercial pattern and that the threads were dyed using an ancient organic substance. possibly animal blood combined with vegetable dyes. I was more perplexed than ever when I got back to town because every hint led to a dead end. Apart from the possibility of septic shock, the autopsy still did not provide a conclusive cause of death. However, there was no evidence that the girl had swallowed the doll or that someone had forced it down her throat. Rather, it seemed as though the doll had just materialized inside her. My annoyance took over. The town's mood became more hostile in subtle ways as I stopped going to see friends and bar, and instead spent my days buried in files and personal notes until dark circles formed under my eyes. Some people blamed me for drawing dark forces by delving too deeply into a cursed case, while others claimed to see strange shadows prowling around the morgue at night and hear a child's cry near the hospital when dusk fell. The most superstitious people thought the girl's spirit wandered in agony because her secrets had been discovered. And every night I sat in my well-lit house, unable to sleep, listening to the wood creak and pondering whether she was pursuing me. When I finally felt overwhelmed one evening, I went back to the morgue, closed the doors, and stepped into the dim glow of the emergency lights. I stood in front of the steel table where I conducted the autopsy and carefully examined the doll, which was primarily made of old cloth filled with what appeared to be hair and lumps of malformed clay where its button eyes had been. There were also shards of glass attached by some odd thread that seemed to be made from plant fibers. The discovery that it contained tiny bones, possibly from small animals, made my stomach turn. The atmosphere seemed to change at that point, and I felt a sudden chill run down the back of my neck. I also thought I heard a faint moan, like a lament in the distance, and I stood frozen, holding that poor doll with such trembling that I almost dropped it. I was unable to move in that sickening stillness, despite my mind screaming for me to run, drop the case, and leave that damned place. I believed that a faint, continuous pulse, like some hidden life throbbing beneath the rag exterior, was coming from inside the doll. I don't know how long I stood there, wanting to scream, but my throat was closed. After being paralyzed by fear, I finally succeeded in pushing the doll back into the bag that night. I refused to leave my small office, afraid that I might find the doll waiting in my bed. I locked myself inside and turned on all the lights, and I fell asleep at my desk. In my dream, I saw a girl rocking in a chair, holding the doll and stroking it in a disturbingly maternal gesture. The girl looked up, her eyes fixed on me, and she mumbled something incomprehensible in a voice that seemed to echo from a deep, abysmal void. I woke up in alarm at the first light of the day, gathering the last of my courage and retrieving the evidence bag, my hands shaking, fearing what I might find inside. That I end the last-ditch effort with the intention of burning the municipal trash to the ground. I drove far out to a remote location. As I watched the flames devour that disgusting rag, I felt a chilly wave of relief. Even now, I'm not sure if it was right or wrong to destroy the thick smoke curling into the sky, but in my desperation, it seemed like the only choice. Following that, the investigation was formally closed. Since no family members came forward to claim the child's remains, I cited a lack of evidence to establish the precise cause of death. The case was filed away, much like so many other tragedies that become part of local legend. My life, however, was never the same. Every time I enter a dark room, I half expect to see those glass eyes staring back. Every strange noise at night reminds me of the beating heart I swear I felt in that doll. Despite the fact that I no longer work in that morgue, I continue to be haunted by nightmares of that girl smiling with the doll stitched into her belly, or by the echo of shrill laughter in the dark corners of my home. Mostly, one question remains unanswered. How did that object come to be there? And spoke with colleagues who research unexplained phenomena, but nobody has been able to provide me with a satisfactory explanation. I've accepted that I will always be afraid because I firmly believe that there are unknowable places in this world where innocent lives are lost, turning reality into a nightmare. Some part of me knows I should destroy the notes and photos I still keep locked up in a cabinet at my new practice, away from prying eyes, but I can't help but hold on. Perhaps it's the irrational hope that one day I'll piece the puzzle together. Or perhaps there's a deeper darkness that ties me to that event in ways I can't fully understand on sleepless nights. I open the cabinet and look at those autopsy photos again, gazing at that blood-soaked doll, remembering the foul smell, and feeling horrified by its twisted face. My life has been centered around denying the existence of ghosts, while sensing them in every flicker of darkness. I've discovered that some stories leave an irrevocable mark, and no matter how hard I try, I can never truly leave that morgue behind or the specter of that little girl. I witnessed a horror that transcends all boundaries, and even though my sanity survived, my soul remains trapped in the shadows of that steel table. I carry this mental prison within me with no way to escape it. When people ask me why I left that town so quickly, I explain that I can't bear to tell the truth because I know that no one would believe me unless they had stood there with a scalpel slicing open an innocent-seeming child and discovered something that is beyond human comprehension. As a result, I live with hazy memories and a persistent terror that haunts me in my nightmares, where I see that blood-stained doll every time I try to fall asleep, and I imagine it still exists somewhere in the world, even if it has been reduced to ashes that have been scattered into something even more evil. That I close my eyes and think back to that crucial instant. The first cut, the foul stench, and the sight of an unfathomable horror. I will always remember its distorted face and mouth opening in a soundless scream that has become a part of me and shakes me to my very core whenever I'm by myself. I'm positive that neither time nor distance, nor my frantic attempts to return things to normal, will be able to erase what I witnessed. That doll became my own shadow the instant I laid eyes on it, serving as a somber reminder that some truths should stay hidden.